Milano,
Bruxelles,
Paris, Madrid.
More European cities than ever were hit by heat waves over the summer, prompting residents and tourists alike to flee to cooler places. As we saw in the previous episode, these heat waves are set to become longer and more frequent, posing an increasing challenge for city dwellers. So how should European mayors respond? My name is Hermine, and I live in Brussels, a city that is indeed experiencing increasingly high temperatures to the point of becoming unbearable. Because the phenomenon of urban heat islands, which is nothing new, but is rapidly intensified by climate change. As a result, a growing number of European cities are today experiencing prolonged period of extreme heat. Here's Leona Eileen Eichel, a climate adaptation expert at Germany's Minden-Lübbecke Environmental Agency, on this topic.
We are seeing that cities are warming particularly strongly with climate change. This is due to what is known as the urban heat island effect, which means that cities store more heat at night than rural areas. In some cities, temperatures can be up to 10 or 15 degrees higher than in the surrounding areas, which of course has an impact on residents. When nighttime cooling is no longer guaranteed and buildings accumulate so much heat, it is naturally more difficult to sleep well, which leads to heat-related consequences that can be very harmful to our health.
Things won't look up if we carry on like this, because it's a vicious, aggravating cycle. The hotter our cities get in the summer, the more we need air conditioning. And with the technologies we've got at the moment, this translates into higher energy uses, which makes the problem worse. Anton Nikitin, the head of sustainability at Vilnius City Municipality, explains what the Lithuanian capital is doing to deal with climate change and help its residents cope with extreme heat.
When
it comes to heat risk management, we try to find nature-based solutions. First of all, there are two important things that cool our city down naturally. The first is trees. We strive to preserve both existing trees and plant new ones, especially on the streets. The other is sustainable grass mowing and sustainable meadows. In some parts of the city, meadows are mowed very, very rarely, once, twice, or maybe 3 times in a season, precisely to allow the grass to grow. In this way, and in fact studies show this, as we have also measured temperatures, the temperature in those places is significantly reduced.
In fact, I read that Berlin approved this November a plan to plant trees all over the city, which they'll be doing over the next 15 years. Bogdan Antonescu, an atmospheric scientist who teaches at the University of Bucharest and an expert on extreme weather phenomena, is on the same page.
Parks and lakes, in other words, green and blue spaces, contribute to reducing the average temperature in cities and, at the same time, also improve air quality and create recreational spaces. Green roofs and green building facades also contribute to providing natural ventilation and reducing the urban heat island.
Antonescu adds that it might be tricky to put this into practice, as it would involve, for example, redesigning cities. Professor Emil Gatchev from the Institute for Climate, Atmosphere and Water Research at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences is more interested in the blue than the green. And here too, we need to stop beating around the bush, accept what's happening and take action.
What is required of us is a change in mindset. We must abandon the illusion that our country enjoys abundant water resources at all times, and instead learn from countries with traditionally arid climates, such as Greece.
Since about 70% of the building stock that will exist in 2050 is already present today, we need to resist bringing in too many new builds, make our existing buildings more sustainable, and ensure that new structures are built for the future. This will all need a bit of mindset shift for everyone. So yes, trees and water are vital, for enabling city dwellers to avoid suffocating in the heat during warm seasons. But the recoloring of public spaces, if I can coin a term, is only part of the problem. It must go hand in hand with changing the way we design and build our homes. The architect Thekla Kirsch also works as a construction consultant at Ökocenter Paffendal, a non-governmental organization from Luxembourg that promotes sustainable development. She's very aware of the role that architecture must play in protecting the climate. So far, the main focus has been on cutting energy use in winter by focusing on thermal insulation. But how much energy do we use in the summer to cool our buildings down?
Heating
technology has already had 30 years of development to make things increasingly efficient. This is still lacking in the field of air conditioning. This means that architecture, in other words, the buildings themselves, will play a key role in the future. I think it's important to understand that a glass box heats up more quickly than something not made entirely of glass. We also need to consider how a building is constructed. In other words, what materials have been used to construct the building? Are these materials capable of storing and buffering the heat coming from outside in order to keep the inside cooler?
When looking at solutions, she also says it's important to be open to ideas that don't involve a lot of technology, because having less technology is often better for the environment. Her organization is also campaigning for renovation to be treated more favorably than new builds in terms of legislation, because too often it is simpler and cheaper to knock down an older building and start from scratch, which is much worse for the environment. Just to let you have a rough idea, the construction sector is responsible for about 40% of global emissions.
When we renovate or convert existing buildings, this only represents half the emissions of a new build. This is why we are really pushing to add value to existing buildings and to make sure that this is facilitated. In other words, for new builds and existing buildings, not to be treated in the same way.
Another important factor is the materials we use in the build, Kirsch adds.
You can,
for example, build with concrete, which results in very high CO2 emissions. Or you can build with renewable raw materials that store carbon and could, in the long term, help to actually reduce carbon emissions by doing so. You can look for ways to store it underground or elsewhere, but you can also store it in the buildings themselves. So instead of generating emissions, the building can actually be used to reduce them.
Anna Terra Amorin Maya, a researcher at the Basque Center for Climate Change, explains more on this.
Options include soil desealing projects, that's removing the impermeable material that covers the ground, replacing tar, asphalt, cement and concrete with more sustainable surfaces that allow water to penetrate the soil. Ideally, replacement with vegetation. But if this is not possible, there are many options for more sustainable surfacing that has small openings and thus absorbs less heat while allowing the infiltration of water.
But as with anything, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Cities all over the world, including Europe, will have to find ways to deal with the challenges they face. I want to hear on how city dwellers can adapt to heat waves, as we discussed this last week in the context of climate and health, focusing on ways to protect the most vulnerable people from the effects of heat waves. So I'll just give Oton Kaminiaris, a diplomat and a researcher from Kapodistrian University in Athens, Greece, an opportunity to remind us that climate change definitely raises questions of social justice.
Heat waves disproportionately affect the elderly, children, the sick, and people without the means to protect themselves, those living in energy poverty, unable to heat or cool their homes adequately.
The thing is, climate change is likely to make social problems in cities worse, especially in poor areas that don't have much green space. What support are member states already drawing from the European Union? For its part, Greece, says Kaminiaris, participates in a number of EU-funded programs.
The European Union already funds numerous projects related to resilience, energy, and climate change through its structural funds, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and research programs such as Horizon Europe and LIFE. Many useful technologies have emerged from these projects. For example, early warning systems for heat waves, wildfires, and floods.
Meanwhile, Egbert Goosen, Secretary General of the European Landscape Contractors Association, says that EU laws, including one that's called the Nature Restoration Law, provide the stick to the carrot that exists at local and national level.
Of course, on national level, you have to determine your ambitions. And of course, you have to, elaborate that on local level. But you see that there is now a stick behind the door that says you have to work on greening the urban area.
Carlo Ratti, an Italian architect and urban planner, teaches at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, where he runs the MIT Sensible City Lab. He says that collaboration and the sharing of best practice will be key to cities sharing experiences and emulating one another.
Cities today often operate as networks. Large cities, for example, are part of the C40 network, in which they come together to combat climate change. There are also other networks linked to small and medium-sized cities. In this way, I would say that innovation and best practice from other countries easily find fertile ground in our country too.
That's all from me today. Next week, in the third and final episode on climate adaptation, we will be looking at farmers and food. Could food security ever become an issue in tomorrow's Europe? I'd like to thank all my colleagues who went to check how things were going in their countries, so that I could tell you all about it here. Stoyan from Bulgaria's BNR Media, my Greek colleagues Nikos and Mariana from Sky Radio, Augustia from Lithuanian Gene Radias, Zina from German media AMS, Sorin from Radio Romania, Mart from Cucu Radio in Estonia, Giulia from Radio 24 in Italy, Alejandra at Radio Renascença in Portugal, Jean-Claude at Luxembourg's 100.7 radio station, and of course, Wojciech from the European podcast. Thank you so much for all your help and support.